What happens when workplace harassment follows you home? Let's explore. There are some workspaces which are absolutely toxic, very toxic, toxic enough to take a mental toll on people, mental toll on professionals. It's a kind of a silent epidemic that's happening in our country. And recently in 2022, one of the journal articles pointed out that almost 50% Indians, professionals especially, have experienced workplace harassment. And I was reading somewhere, monster.com, a very big job site, that reported almost 55% Indian professionals experiencing harassment. The problem is huge. And when I say harassment, I am referring to all the mental harassment, the emotional harassment that one experiences in a workspace. You know what is interesting is we all talk about right to life. How about right to work with dignity? To explore harassment as an issue further, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a previous year's case study from 2022. And I'll discuss the case study. As I'm discussing the case study, I'll also talk about how a professional or how anybody can cope with harassment at workplace. Let's start with the case outline. Pawan is working as an officer in the state government for the last 10 years. As part of routine transfer, he was posted to another department. He joined in a new office along with 5 other colleagues. The head of the office was a senior officer conversant with functioning of the office. As part of general inquiry, Pawan gathered that his senior officer carries the reputation of being difficult and insensitive person, having his own disturbed family life. Initially, all seemed to go well. How after some time, Pawan felt that senior officer was belittling him and at times unreasonable. Whatever suggestions given or views expressed by Pawan in the meetings was summarily rejected, and the senior officer would express displeasure in the presence of others. It became a pattern of boss's style of functioning to show him in bad light, highlighting his shortcomings and humiliating publicly. It became apparent that though there were no serious work-related problems, shortcomings, the senior officer was always, on one pretext or the other, would scold and shout at him. The continuous harassment and public criticism of Pawan resulted in loss of confidence, self-esteem and equanimity. Pawan realized that his relation with the senior officer was becoming more toxic. Due to this, he felt perpetually tensed, anxious and stressed. His mind was occupied with negativity, caused him mental torture, anguish and agony. Eventually, it badly affected his personal and family life. He was no longer joyous, happy and contented even at home. Rather, without any reason, he would lose his temper with his wife and other family members. The family environment was no longer pleasant and congenial. His wife was always supportive to him, also became a victim of his negativity and hostile behavior. Due to harassment and humiliation suffered by him in the office, comfort and happiness virtually vanished from his life. Thus, it damaged his physical and mental health. This is what we call workplace harassment following you home. Now let's come down to the questions. There were 4 questions that year. The first question was, what are the options available to Pawan to cope with the situation? That was the first one. Second one, what approach Pawan should adopt for bringing peace, tranquility and congenial environment in office at home? Third question, as an outsider, what are your suggestions for both boss and subordinate to overcome this situation and for improving the work performance, mental and emotional hygiene? In the above scenario, fourth question, in the above scenario, what type of training would you suggest for officers at various levels in government offices? Before we get into the questions, let me give you an exam tip. Now, next time when you read a case study, please note there are some key words. In fact, if you can understand the key words, you can actually make out what are the issues that's happening in the case. Now, when you read the case, you come across words such as harassment, toxic, public humiliation, mental torture, loss of confidence, stress and anxiety, hostile behavior, mental health. Now, if you see the first 4 words, that's the issue. If you look at the last 4 words, that's a consequence. Yes, this case is about harassment, true. But one needs to understand that harassment is happening because of bad boss. So in a way, Pawan needs to learn how to handle a bad boss here. You know, in offices, sometimes we run into seniors who can be absolutely toxic. who can actually make your life miserable, and that's what is happening with Pawan. And Pawan needs to handle this. Pawan needs to find a way to overcome that emotional stress that is created in the office. Oh, Pawan needs to learn how to navigate a toxic work culture. You cannot run away, you cannot resign from the job just because the office is toxic. You need to find a way to handle it. And if you look at the questions, they focus on the same. So let's take the first question. Let's come on to the first question. When you see the first question, look at the words. It says, what are the options available to Pawan to cope with the situation? The key word is not option, the key word is cope. Now, usually when students do case studies, they immediately start giving me solutions to a problem. Here, there's no problem. Here, there's just a challenge. So that's why the word is cope. So you need to understand the word cope if you need to get the answer correct. And when I say cope, cope is all about managing a difficult situation. If you ask me, the first option that Pawan can explore here is to find some allies in the office. He can talk to some seniors, confidentially of course. He can talk to some senior colleagues, discuss his problem and ask for advice how to handle a senior, how to handle his boss, and what's the best way to handle. Who knows, probably there may be an empathetic senior who understands Pawan's situation, and probably he may help mediate the whole situation. He may act as a mediator and or a go-between Pawan and his boss and help Pawan out. There's always a possibility. The next thing that Pawan can do is he can muster some courage. Oh yes, this is what virtue ethics is all about. Muster some courage, gather some moral courage, and seek an appointment with the boss and have a polite conversation with him. I think that works, right? Just talk to your boss. Pawan can do that. Seek an appointment, talk to him, explain the situation, that how it's impacting his emotional health, how it's impacting his personal life at home, and try to find a way so that Pawan should explore ways so that he can improve his work. Try to find out the problem. What exactly is the issue? Why he's being humiliated? What's the reason? Is it work related or if something personal? Find out. Third option is more about self-protection. Since Pawan is being constantly humiliated publicly, constantly scolded, Pawan should start documenting things. He should keep a track of when, what was said, what was the comment, was it personal or was it work related. He should start documenting it. That's called self-protection. Who knows, later there may be a situation where Pawan needs to escalate it. Pawan needs to raise the issue internally with higher up. So when you're raising an issue internally, you need to have all the data, you need to have specifics. If the situation does not improve in office, just imagine Pawan seeks an appointment, talks to the boss, and despite that, despite all the efforts, if the things get really ugly, if things reach a stage where Pawan needs to escalate things, so Pawan can always think about a legal option. Oh yes, we do have legal options available. Government of India also has legal options. And since Pawan is already documenting the instances, he can take a legal advice and explore legal avenues. And the last option that Pawan has is to seek transfer. Because you try everything. You try talking to him, you try to find allies, nothing works. So finally, Pawan has no option. He can always request for a transfer. And he can seek a request for transfer because after all, your emotional health matters. The next question is a very interesting one. This question is about what approach Pawan should adopt to bring peace and tranquility at home and in office. To bring peace at home and in office, Pawan needs to take a multifaceted approach here. In fact, I would advise Pawan to start working on his emotional competencies. Yes. You know, the whole toxic work culture, whole humiliation, the whole behavior of the boss is taking an emotional toll on Pawan. So Pawan should start working on his emotional intelligence skills. And when I say emotional intelligence, he needs to work on two things here. One, he needs to work on his personal emotional competence. Then he needs to work on something called social competence. I'll come to social competence later. But the first thing Pawan needs to work on is his personal emotional competence. Now, for example, when the boss is humiliating, you cannot control the boss, but what you can control is your reaction, your emotional reaction to the whole thing. Now, that's where self awareness comes into play. And self awareness is a very powerful emotional competency to cultivate for every professional. Besides personal competence, Pawan also needs to cultivate this EI competence of being socially competent. When I say socially competent, Pawan should get better at relationship management. And one of the key aspects of relationship management is conflict resolution. We all have to learn to handle conflicts. Conflicts are every day. We have conflicts at home, we have conflicts in office. So Pawan should start learning this art of managing conflict. The next thing that Pawan needs to learn is something called handling stress, which we call stress tolerance or stress management skills. It's a very important thing to have. I remember Baron here, Baron is a scholar who worked a lot on emotional intelligence, and he gave 5 dimensions of emotional skills, 5 emotional competence. And one of the big competence he spoke about was stress management. And we all learn to manage stress. When you're working in a workspace, stress is bound to be there. And the stress may come from your toxic boss, or sometimes stress may be tight deadlines also. So one skill that Pawan needs to learn is about stress management. These are all suggestions focused on managing the emotional fallout of the whole toxic workplace situation. Let's come to something else. What Pawan can do is he can talk to a third party. He can seek some professional help here. He can talk to the company HR or the departmental counselor, or seek a professional help outside the department also. He can go talk to a counselor and try to find a way to navigate this whole emotional mess he is in. And there's nothing wrong in speaking to a professional counselor. In India, we have this stigma of going and speaking to a clinical psychologist. Why not? Why not? Why not? One should do that. It helps. The next advice, or the next thing that Pawan should adopt here, is something called honest communication. He should communicate honestly with his wife, transparency. He should tell his family members what exactly he's going through in office. Sometimes people are not very open at home because they feel the people at home will not understand. Actually, when you communicate frankly, when you communicate honestly, everybody will understand. Speaking of communication, I'll also advise Pawan to have a constructive dialogue with the boss also. Yes. Pawan cannot always play victim and stay on the boundaries. He needs to have a constructive dialogue with the boss. The last thing that Pawan can adopt, or the last advice I have for Pawan, is something very difficult, seriously very difficult. This is what we call compartmentalization. This is what we call setting boundaries. I'm sure all of you must have heard this phrase that don't bring office home. In other words, don't bring work home. Easier said than done. Just imagine you're working in office for 8 hours. So when you come home, it will be there in your head. But Pawan needs to learn the skill of compartmentalizing, setting boundaries. Okay, this is work, it stays at office. This is home. I'll not bring work into home. Let's come on to the third question. It's a very interesting question. The question is, as an outsider, now it's completely coming to you. As an outsider, what advice you'll have for Pawan and for his boss to improve work performance, mental and emotional hygiene? Look at the 3 words, very interesting. Work performance, mental and emotional hygiene. So you have to give them an advice both to boss and to Pawan. As an outsider, the first advice I'll have for the boss that he should cultivate the right leadership style. If you look at the whole leadership style, it's very toxic. I think the boss believes more in negative reinforcement, constantly scolding, constantly humiliating. In fact, some bosses in our country have this habit. They personally feel that the more I scold, the more I humiliate, the person will work harder, the person will stay more committed. No, it doesn't work like that. Negative reinforcement never works. It only ruins productivity. So what the boss should learn is he should learn this art of positive reinforcement. The second advice I'll have for the boss is he should start working on his emotional intelligence competencies. He should seriously start working on his self-awareness. For example, like boss should become aware how his words or how his feedback, how his humiliating feedback has an impact on others. The moment he becomes aware of this, probably he'll cut down his toxic behavior. And the next feedback as an outsider I have for the boss is he should learn or he should undergo some kind of conflict resolution training. The boss needs to find a way to, the boss needs to learn to resolve conflicts. Because what is happening here is continuous conflicts every day, continuous clash, even though it's with subordinates, it's ruining everybody. I'm very, very sure when the boss scolds or humiliates Pawan, I'm sure the entire office is noticing it. I'm sure that whole act of scolding or humiliating will have an impact on others also. As an outsider, the last piece of advice that I have for the boss is he should seek some professional help. Because if you look at the beginning of the case, there's a sentence which says the boss had some problems at home. So probably, who knows, an unsettled home is being reflected in his workplace. So if he goes for a therapy, if he goes for a counseling, probably that will improve things at home. And by improving things at home, he can also ensure a calmer, more productive and emotionally stable workplace, or I should say emotionally settled workplace. On to Pawan, the subordinate. Now Pawan needs to work on one very important skill, his communication skill. If you look at the whole issue, Pawan is not able to communicate the issue at home. Pawan is not able to resolve conflict with his boss. Why? Because probably he's not able to communicate with his boss very well. So everything boils down to Pawan's communication skill. The other advice I have for Pawan as an outsider is he should become a little bit more resilient. When I say resilient, you cannot give up so quickly. Just because few instances or just because few scoldings, you cannot get personal and you cannot be traumatized about it. Be a little resilient, be tough. And speaking of resilience, one way to learn to be more resilient is he should cultivate his stress handling capacities also. He should be able to handle stress much better. And the last thing as an outsider, what I feel is Pawan needs to have a good mentor. Pawan needs to identify some seniors with whom he can communicate and be mentored. It's very important officers to have a mentor. Now let's come on to the last question. It's a very interesting one. The question states, in the above scenario, that is, keep the case in perspective and suggest training programs for government officers. Now when it comes to suggesting training, the very first obvious training that I can recommend or we should recommend is emotional intelligence training. If you look at the whole case, this case is more of an emotional issue here. This case somewhere down the line shows Pawan lacks emotional skills. Even the boss lacked emotional quotient. So the first training I'll recommend is emotional intelligence training. And there also I'll recommend a training which is focused on self-awareness, self-control, relationship management, empathy, because these are the key aspects of a good workplace. The second training I'll recommend is leadership training. When I say leadership training, if you look at the whole case, it was a very, very toxic leadership. The kind of leadership practice that's clear in the case study, it's a leadership style based on negative reinforcement, very authoritarian kind of a leadership. No. We need to train them in something called participative leadership or transformational leadership practices, or a leader who's more of a mentor so that he can actually mentor the subordinates. So a leadership training is a must here. A very important, I should say a very critical training program I'll recommend is the officers should have something called workplace harassment training. Yes, as of now we have sexual harassment, POSH connected prevention of sexual harassment training programs in all offices, but I'll recommend something called workplace harassment also. You should teach staff that every human being has a right to work in a dignified manner. One, they should be sensitized about how workplace harassment impacts an individual, how harassment at workplace or a toxic workplace can take emotional toll and reduce productivity. So one of the trainings I'll recommend is conflict resolution. When I say conflict resolution, it's about learning how to diffuse a conflict, one. It's about how to mediate in a conflict. Or it's also about how to resolve a conflict in a manner without causing that emotional trauma. And handling conflict is a very, very big skill to have in offices. I repeat, it's a very big skill to have in offices. And interestingly, workplace productivity suffers maximum due to conflicts. People stop working because of conflict. Oh, I don't get along with my boss, so why should I bother? That's his problem. So that's why conflict resolution matters. And what is interesting is, if you don't resolve conflicts, the conflicts keeps festering. And the more it festers, it becomes a bigger problem. Any kind of work is stressful. Actually, when I say stress, I have two things here. Every officer will have two things: work pressure and work stress. Work pressure is good. Little bit of pressure makes sense, because without pressure, human becomes lazy. Yes, without that pressure, we will keep postponing things. So little bit of work pressure is good, but stress is not good. Stress is not good. When the pressure gets accumulated, it converts to stress. And if you look at this office, if you look at the case also, the stress was building up. It was not pressure, the stress was building up. Pawan constantly felt he's under scrutiny. His boss constantly humiliates him. Stress was building up. So this is where we need to learn stress management. We looked at all the 4 questions, and if you look at all the 4 questions, they all had different themes. First was about coping. Second was about what approach Pawan should have. Third was about what the boss should do, what the subordinate should do. Then last one was very, very, very interesting question about training programs. All the 4 questions are different flavor. And the key of this whole question was about emotional skills. Now, it's about how to handle harassment. It's about how to handle the emotional fallout of workplace harassment. Now, remember this: emotional fallout of a workplace harassment. And one more layer to this case is all about how do you handle a bad boss? How do you handle a toxic boss? I think we covered all the bases today. Before I close, I have an observation. I have been in training for a very long time. In fact, I've spent around 3 decades training officers, training corporate professionals, and I've seen almost all the leadership training workshops or all the workshops that I do. The issue of harassment always pops up. And the challenge in India is we have this, whenever the issue of harassment happens, we tend to ignore it. So I have a request, I have an advice to all of you. Next time when you have an issue of harassment, please face it. Don't deny it, don't ignore it, don't brush it under the carpet, because every harassment issue will have an emotional toll attached to it. There's an emotional price to harassment. And it actually takes, it actually takes away your emotional health. It destroys your well-being. So that's why don't brush it under the carpet. If you need any help or if you need any suggestion on how to handle harassments, feel free to leave a comment, or probably you can mail me. And my mail is kmpathi@gmail.com, kmpathi@gmail.com. You can mail me. We can get on we can chat about it. Who knows, probably I'm able to help you here. So with that message, I'll close today's session. Happy learning. So long, and please take care of yourself.